Okay, this is how to factor out any type of problem that you're going to have in Algebra 1. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to look at what all the terms have in common, also known as your GCF. Now, we've already done factoring out, but in reverse form. So if you look at it, look at your distributive property. If you have 2x times x to the third minus 4x plus 3. Remember, when you distribute, you first took that 2x to every term inside. Now, x to the third, remember, it's the implied 1 in front. So take your coefficients first. 2 times 1 is 2. X times x to the third is x to the fourth. Now, 2 times negative 4 for next term is negative 8, and x times x is x squared. Now, for a third term, 2 times 3 is positive 6, and the x from the 2x. So this is it when you distribute the 2x. So now when you factor out, you're doing it exactly in reverse. Start with your coefficients. What does each term, what's the greatest common factor of each term? So 2, negative 8, and 6, your greatest common factor is 2. Then you look at your variables. You have an x to the fourth, you have an x to the second, and you have an x. The greatest value for each of those, remember they each have to have the amount you pick, would be x. So now look at it. So now you divide. Start with your coefficient. What's 2 divided by 2? 1. What's x to the fourth divided by x? X to the third, which can also just be written simply as x to the third. Our minus sign, what's 8 divided by 2? That's 4. What's 4x? What's x squared divided by x? That's simply x. Our plus sign, 6 divided by 2 is 3. X divided by x is just 1. So now we've worked it both directions. We saw what we've done with distributing and now factoring out. Factoring out is the first step for any factoring problem. You look for the greatest common factor that's in every single term. The next step is easy enough. It's count the number of terms. So this has 2 terms. This problem has 3 terms, and so on. It's the number of terms. That's your next step. Just count how many there are, and that will tell you where you go. If there are 2 terms, you're going to look for a difference of squares. And let's go review what a difference of squares are. Remember, first this is after you've factored out the greatest common factor. So if we had x squared minus 16, how you determine difference of squares is you have to look at your first term, which would be x times x. So x squared is a perfect square, and the square root of x squared is x. 16 is 4 times 4, and the square root of 16 is 4. So 16 is a perfect square. And we have our negative sign in between. So how we would solve that is we take our first value, the square root of the first value, which is x. We take either plus or minus, whichever way you want to go first, and then the next will be x minus. And then we take our last term, the square root of that, which is 4, and that goes up into the last position for each of the problems. So it becomes the sum of x plus 4 times the difference of x minus 4. This is a difference of squares. You can only do a difference of squares if you have 2 terms. Now we're going to look at the scenarios for if there are 3 terms. The first one we're going to look for, because it's formulatic and it's very easy to solve, if it's a trinomial square. Once again, to refresh, you have to look. Let's take the example x squared plus 6xy plus 9y squared. Okay, to figure out if it's a trinomial square, is the first term a perfect square? Well, the square root of x squared is x, so yes, that's a perfect square. Is the last term a perfect square? So is 9y squared a perfect square? Well, yes, the square root of 9 is 3, and the square root of y squared is y. So they're both ends, your first term and your last term, are perfect squares. Now you have to look at the middle. You have to take your first term times your last term and double it. So put in correct order. Coefficients first. 2 times 3 is 6. X times y is xy. Is 6xy. That's the middle term, so this is a perfect trinomial square. So what you do for this is you take your first term x that we've already done, and we take our last term, 3y. We look at it and we see that it's all positives in there, so it's going to be plus in here, and we're going to square it. So that's your trinomial square. If it's not a trinomial square, and it's in the format of x squared plus bx plus c, and b and c stand for numbers, look at how you can factor out. Let's take the example, x squared plus 11x plus 30. So what you're going to do is, you know that x is your first term, and it's squared. So write your parentheses, and so you know they're both going to start with x. You look at both of your signs, they're both positive, so you know that it's going to be a positive for both of them. So now, all we need is what goes next to it. So we're going to look at two numbers. Our last term, remember foiling, it was the two n numbers multiplied. So we need a number that multiplies to 30 and adds to 11. If you don't remember, let's go back to foiling, because remember the two last terms in each one, this term and this term, have got to equal 30. And then when we add them, when we do our outside and our inside, those are added, which will give us the 11. So since they're all positive, it's pretty easy. Just look at all the multiples of 30. I've got 1 times 30. I've got 2 times 15. I have got 5 times 6. Those are our factors on how we get to 30. Now add them. 1 plus 30 equals 31. That's not the number we're looking for. 2 plus 15 is equal to 17. Not the number we're looking for. 5 plus 6 is equal to 11. That's the number that we're looking for. So what we do is we put in our 5 and our 6. And that's how we factor out. Now, I want to look at it just a little bit different. Let's take it and let's look at what happens when we have a negative in there. So let's take x squared minus 8xy plus 15y squared. Well, remember before I said how we started? That we knew that the first term was x squared, so each one of these has to start with a value of x. But look at our last term. We've got 15y squared. So I know that y has to be a term in each one of these, and it goes at the end. Now look at your signs. You have a negative and a positive. The only way that you can add two numbers together to get a negative and multiply two numbers to get a positive would be if they were both negative. Because if you're adding a negative plus a negative, it will obviously give you a negative. And if you multiply a negative times a negative, it's going to give you a positive number. So now you're going to make a chart just like we did before. We need to multiply to 15 and add to negative 8. So, well, since we're adding to a negative number, we know they're both negative, so just look at your terms that you're factoring. So 1 and 15, and 3 and 5. So negative 1 plus negative 15 equals negative 16. That's not our number. And negative 3 plus negative 5 is negative 8. That's our number. So we're going to take our negative 3 and our negative 5, and that is completely factored out. Let's try the third scenario that we can have. And that would be if we have two negative signs. One in the middle. So let's do x squared minus xy minus 2y squared. So once again, let's write our brackets. It's the first way to start. And we know that it starts with x squared, so I know there has to be an x value in each one of our brackets. And our last term is 2y squared, so I know there has to be a y in each of our brackets. Now let's look at what kind of symbols we're going to use, addition or subtraction. Well, I know it's negative, so you can get negative by adding two negatives or adding a positive and a negative, and the negative value being higher. But I also need it to multiply to a negative, and the only way to multiply to a negative is a positive times a negative. So now let's go back to our chart. I'm going to see two numbers that multiply to negative 2 and add to negative 1. Remember, it's negative xy, it's the implied 1. So to add to multiply to negative 2, I could have negative 1 times 2, or I could have 1 times negative 2, correct? So negative 1 plus 2 is equal to 2, and 1 minus 2 is equal to negative 1. It's our second term, so it's a positive 1 and a negative 2. Make sure you check all these as you go through them.